Victoria Hale stepped into the courtroom, a calm and composed figure. Across from her, her brother Ethan stood with a smirk, accusing her of being insane. But Victoria wasn't the one who'd lost control. She had a secret. A sealed envelope in her hands, one that contained an arrest warrant, was all she needed. For years, Ethan had controlled their family, and now she would expose the truth. She wasn't broken. She was ready for war. In the next few moments, everything would change. Ethan's world was about to crumble, and he would never see it coming. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Victoria Hale walked in. Her heels clicked on the cold marble floor, echoing in the silence. She kept her head high, her eyes forward, unwavering. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of what was about to happen. Her brother Ethan sat across the room, a look of self-assuredness plastered on his face as he stared down at her. His cold eyes never left her as he spoke to the judge. "Your Honour, my sister, Victoria Hale, is no longer the person she once was. She has lost her mind. The trauma of war has broken her, and it is my responsibility as her family to ensure she gets the help she so desperately needs." His voice quivered slightly, but it was a practiced quiver, one that exuded authority and sorrow. His words were laced with enough fake empathy to make anyone in the room believe him. Victoria felt her heart turn cold as she listened to him. For years she had been told that she wasn't enough, that she wasn't worthy, but this was the final blow. He was trying to erase her completely, to strip her of everything that made her who she was. Victoria remained silent, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her knuckles turned white as the weight of the moment settled over her. She was the one on trial, yet she felt like she was the only one who could see the truth. Ethan had always been the golden child in their family. Everything he did was celebrated, while her achievements were ignored or downplayed. He was the perfect son, the perfect brother. But she had always been the afterthought, the screw-up, the one no one truly cared about. Ethan's lawyer stepped forward, a slick man in a sharp suit, his smile too wide, too rehearsed. He addressed the judge with a confident, practiced tone, the kind of voice that made you believe that the world was black and white and that Victoria was nothing more than a victim of her own making. "Your Honour, we have evidence that supports my client's concerns about his sister's well-being," the lawyer said, nodding toward the screen at the front of the courtroom. The screen flickered to life, revealing a grainy, shaky video. There she was, a lone figure in the woods, her face obscured by shadows, her voice barely audible as she moved through the trees. The footage was from a night when Victoria had ventured into the woods alone, something she did every year to honour the men she had lost in combat. But to Ethan and his lawyer, it was proof of her insanity. "She wanders the woods at night, talking to herself," Ethan's voice echoed in the courtroom. "She's haunted by ghosts from her past. She's no longer the sister I once knew." Victoria's breath caught in her throat as she listened to him twist her grief into something grotesque. He had no idea what the ritual meant to her. He hadn't been there. He hadn't known the pain of losing her comrades, the guilt of surviving when they didn't. That video wasn't a sign of madness. It was a prayer, a tribute to the fallen. But she knew that none of that mattered now. Her brother had painted her as a broken woman, unfit to stand on her own. The judge, a stern man with greying hair, looked at the screen, his face unreadable. He glanced down at the papers in front of him, flipping through the psychiatric evaluation Ethan's lawyer had presented. The words on the page leapt out at her. Borderline personality disorder, paranoid ideations, severe PTSD. Each word was a hammer driving deeper into her sense of self. It felt like they were killing her all over again, this time with legal jargon instead of bullets. Victoria could see the doubt in the judge's eyes as he looked from the report to her. The entire room, from the court clerk to the audience in the gallery, seemed to shift. They weren't looking at her as a decorated officer in the Green Berets anymore. They were looking at her as a broken woman, a tragic casualty of war. The judge cleared his throat and turned his gaze to her. His voice was soft, almost pitying. "Miss Hale," he said gently, "do you have anything to say?" The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The weight of his words crushed her, but she refused to break. She refused to give them the satisfaction. She would not be their broken soldier, their tragic story. Instead, she sat there, her back straight, her face impassive, the anger inside her simmering but controlled. Victoria didn't say a word. Her silence was the strongest weapon she had left. But as the tension in the room built, Victoria's hand moved slowly to the briefcase beside her. She took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the sealed envelope inside. The air around her seemed to thicken, and her heartbeat quickened. She could feel the change in the room, the shift from judgment to something else, something unexpected. Without a word, she placed the envelope on the table in front of her and pushed it forward, just enough for the judge to see. "Your Honour," she said, her voice steady and calm, "I would like to submit this into evidence." There was a moment of silence before the judge nodded and reluctantly took the envelope. He tore it open, his eyes scanning the contents quickly. The courtroom waited, the air thick with expectation. The judge's eyes widened as he read the document, his expression shifting from indifference to something else, something far more serious. He looked up at Ethan, who suddenly seemed less sure of himself. The room held its breath as the truth began to unravel. And then, without warning, the doors of the courtroom slammed open, and a group of 12 soldiers, Green Berets, their uniforms crisp and unyielding, walked in, moving with silent precision. Behind them, Major Hale Raw stepped forward, his eyes locked on Ethan, his voice a booming command. "Ethan Hale," Major Raw declared, "you are under arrest by the Department of Defense for fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government." Ethan's face drained of colour as the soldiers closed in. The courtroom was stunned into silence. It was over. Victoria sat quietly in the courtroom, her gaze steady but distant. The whispers of the onlookers buzzed around her like a swarm of gnats, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were elsewhere, back to the moment she had decided to confront Ethan, back to the house they once shared, to the family that had never truly been hers. She could still remember the first time Ethan had betrayed her, though it hadn't been the sharp, clean betrayal she expected. It had been slow, like water dripping on stone, wearisome and persistent. Each time she succeeded, each time she did something remarkable, her accomplishments were either ignored or brushed aside. But for Ethan, every time he breathed, it was a victory. His triumphs, no matter how small, were magnified in the family narrative. "Remember when Ethan got the scholarship to Harvard?" her mother would say, her voice thick with pride. "He was always the one with potential." Victoria never stood a chance. She had fought her entire life for acknowledgement, yet all she received were half-hearted nods. And when she succeeded, when she brought home trophies or awards, they were overshadowed by Ethan's newest achievement. "That's nice, Victoria," her father would mutter, a faraway look in his eyes as he shifted his attention back to Ethan. Ethan had always been the star, she, the supporting character in his grand drama, but this betrayal, it was different. It wasn't just an emotional wound, it was a full-blown attack on her very identity. Ethan had taken it a step too far when he sold their parents' house behind her back, using their mother's illness as an excuse to push her out. He knew she wouldn't challenge him, wouldn't remember signing the papers. After all, the last few months had been a blur for her, torn between her military service and dealing with a family that had never seemed to care about her. At least that's what she thought. The day she returned to find a sold sign on the front lawn was the final straw. Her hands trembled as she dialed Ethan's number, her heart pounding in her chest. But when he answered, his voice was calm, far too calm. "Oh, that," Ethan said, as if it were no big deal. "I forgot to tell you. You signed the power of attorney when you were at Walter Reed, remember? You said you didn't want the burden of the house anymore." Victoria froze. She couldn't remember ever signing such a document, but Ethan's tone was so nonchalant, so authoritative. Her head spun and a sinking feeling gripped her heart. Maybe he was right. Could she have forgotten? That seed of doubt, planted carefully by her brother, began to take root. But Victoria wasn't the woman she had been a few years ago. She had been through too much, had fought too many battles, both on the field and off, to let herself slip into that kind of confusion. She wasn't a child anymore, and she wasn't going to let Ethan erase her memories. But when she confronted him, when she asked why he hadn't told her, why he hadn't respected her wishes, he didn't even apologize. Instead, he made her feel like the problem. He cast the blame on her for being absent, for being difficult, as though it were her fault that the family had fallen apart. And so Victoria did what she had always done. She retreated into herself. She remained silent, letting the accusations and the weight of her family's indifference settle around her like a suffocating fog. She could feel the isolation creeping in, an isolation she had known for so long. It was as though they had all abandoned her, even before she left for war. It wasn't until she had left her family's house and was alone in the quiet of her apartment that the true weight of Ethan's actions hit her. He had taken everything, her memories, her place in the family, and twisted it to fit his narrative. He had turned her into the villain in their shared history. But this time she wasn't going to stay silent. She wasn't going to let him have the last word. As the courtroom drama unfolded, Victoria could feel the tension mounting. Every word Ethan spoke was designed to break her. He was trying to convince the court and her that she wasn't capable of making decisions for herself. She wasn't fit to live freely. She needed him. She needed their family, he said. And for a moment it felt like he might win. The judge had that look in his eyes, the same pitying look she had seen so many times before, the look that made her feel small and insignificant. But that was before she pushed the envelope forward. Before she gave them the proof, the sealed arrest warrant signed by the Department of Defense. Proof that Ethan wasn't the victim he was trying to make himself out to be. Proof that he was, in fact, the perpetrator. At that moment, Victoria felt a shift. It wasn't an explosion of triumph, but a quiet, overwhelming realization. This was it. Her fight was no longer just about family, it was about justice, and with that she watched as Ethan's world began to crumble. Victoria sat by the window of her small apartment, gazing out at the city below, but her mind was 1,000 miles away, lost in the haze of the past. The courtroom, her brother's accusations, it all felt so distant now. The truth was she had never really been part of the family she'd been born into. And as the years had passed, the realization had slowly crept in. She had been invisible to them. Invisible, not because they didn't see her, but because they refused to. Her thoughts drifted to her childhood, those early years when she had still believed that if she tried hard enough, if she did everything perfectly, she might earn their love and approval. But no matter how many times she brought home top grades, or when she won awards for science projects, or even the time she scored the winning basket in a championship game, it was never enough. "Good job, Victoria," her father would say, his voice flat, barely lifting from the dinner table. "But it's not like you can do that every day. You're the girl, remember? Just don't hurt yourself, okay?" Meanwhile, Ethan, her older brother, was always the one who received their praise. His achievements, no matter how small, were lauded like the accomplishments of a king. His first report card was framed and displayed on the mantelpiece, while hers, with all A's, was never even mentioned. "Look, he's got a full scholarship to Harvard. Can you believe it?" their mother would exclaim, voice rising with pride. "Ethan's going places. I knew it from the moment he was born." Victoria had learned early on that she was meant to stay in the shadows of her brother's success. She was the one who helped him with his homework, the one who quietly cheered him on from the sidelines. Her place was clear, to support Ethan's rise, while hers was meant to remain hidden, an afterthought. But it wasn't until later, when she enlisted in the military, that she realized just how deep, this pattern of neglect and favoritism ran. The military had offered her a way out, a way to escape the suffocating weight of her family's expectations. And for a while, it had been enough. The army had given her purpose, given her recognition that had long been absent from her home. It gave her something her family never had, respect. And for a while that was enough. But now, sitting in her apartment, Victoria was forced to confront the painful truth. Her family had never truly seen her. Not really. They had only ever seen what they wanted from her, what they could use. The sound of her phone buzzing broke her from her reverie. It was a text from one of her old comrades, a man she had fought alongside in the field. His words were simple, but they carried weight. "We're all still here for you, Vic. You're not alone." A lump formed in her throat as she read the message. They had been her real family, the soldiers who had fought beside her, who had seen her at her worst and still respected her. They didn't need to ask for her approval, and they never made her feel small. It had taken her years to understand this, but now it was clear they were her true family. The buzz of her phone reminded her that there was still unfinished business. Ethan had sold their parents' house, the house that had once been her sanctuary. She remembered every corner of it, the worn oak floors, the smell of her mother's cooking in the kitchen, the small creaky steps that led to her childhood bedroom. And now it was gone, sold without her knowledge or consent. Victoria's heart sank as she thought back to the conversation she had with Ethan that day. She had asked him, confronted him about the sale, but instead of explaining, he had shrugged her off with the same practiced indifference that had always been his hallmark. "You signed the power of attorney when you were at Walter Reed," he had said, his voice cool and unaffected. "Remember, you said you didn't want the burden of the house anymore." A wave of confusion hit her. She didn't remember signing anything. Could she have? The hospital stay, the trauma, it had all blurred together. Could Ethan have manipulated her in such a way? The thought made her stomach twist with nausea. The seed of doubt that had been planted by her brother began to take root. Was she really that weak, that gullible? Was it possible she had signed away her rights without realizing it? Her mind raced as she replayed the conversation over and over. It felt like a betrayal, but it also felt like something more. A betrayal of her memory, of her own identity. How much of her life had Ethan taken from her without her knowing? Victoria's hands trembled as she stared at her phone. She had to know the truth. But to find it, she would need to confront the past. She would need to dig through the papers, the records, the documents, everything that had been hidden from her. She couldn't let Ethan get away with this, not this time. With newfound resolve, Victoria stood up and grabbed her coat. She wasn't going to let the confusion cloud her anymore. She was going to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from her comrade. "You've got this, Vic. We're all rooting for you." A sense of peace settled over her as she put her phone down. She wasn't going to fight this alone. Her real family, her brothers and sisters in arms, were with her. With that, Victoria made her decision. It was time to dig into her past, to search for the truth she so desperately needed. Victoria stood still in the middle of her apartment, her mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. The weight of her past, the memories, the doubts, the betrayals, were pressing in on her. It was like trying to breathe through a heavy fog. She reached for the stack of old family photos sitting on her table, and her fingers trembled as she picked them up. Her childhood had been a series of moments that seemed insignificant to others, but were monumental to her. Ethan had always been the centre of attention, and everything she did was seen as just a stepping stone for him. Her mother's bright, proud smile when Ethan came home with another achievement. Her father's tired, distant gaze as he patted Ethan on the back. She remembered the way he'd always been the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. And she had always been the one who was left behind, the shadow. There were so many little moments that seemed trivial, but now they were all coming back. She had been the straight-A student, but her efforts never felt enough. Her science fair project, which had outshone Ethan's, was simply brushed aside by her parents. "Good job, Vic. You'll get them next time," they had said, the words as empty as they were familiar. But when Ethan managed to land a spot at an elite summer camp, her parents' pride filled the room. "I knew you could do it, Ethan," her mother would say. "You're going to change the world." And in those moments, Victoria felt invisible. She was always the supporting character in a story that wasn't hers. It was as if she was always just behind the curtain, cheering him on, but never being seen herself. Yet she had always been the one to help Ethan. She had been the one who stayed up late, helping him with his homework when he struggled. She had never once asked for recognition. All she wanted was for someone, anyone, to notice her for once. But when the opportunity had come for her to be something more than the background player, her family turned their backs on her. She had enlisted in the army, hoping to forge a new path, to escape the life of constant comparison. And for a while, it had worked. She had earned her place in the military, respected and feared for her skills. But when she returned home after the service, the reality of her family's indifference hit her like a brick wall. And now, this, the sale of the family home, the one place where she had hoped to find some sense of belonging. Her childhood, her memories, were all wrapped up in that house. It wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of everything she had endured, everything she had tried to prove, and now it was gone. She couldn't believe it at first. When she had asked Ethan about the sale, he had been dismissive, almost indifferent. "You signed the power of attorney when you were at Walter Reed," he had said, like it was no big deal. His words had sent a wave of panic through her. She didn't remember signing anything, especially not when she had been recovering from the injury that had nearly taken her life. She had been vulnerable, confused, and just as Ethan knew she would, she had trusted him. The seed of doubt he had planted began to grow, and for the first time in years, Victoria felt a crack in her confidence. Could she have really signed the papers? Could she have been so easily manipulated? The thought made her sick to her stomach, but then something shifted. As the weight of this realization pressed down on her, her phone buzzed. It was a text from one of her old comrades, someone she trusted implicitly. "We've got your back, Vic. Don't let him win." The words were simple, but they brought her back to herself. She wasn't alone. These people, her brothers and sisters in arms, had never doubted her. They had stood by her side in the hardest of times, and now they were offering their support once more. They hadn't forgotten her, and they never would. Her thoughts became clearer, her resolve harder. She wasn't going to let Ethan's manipulation win. She wasn't going to let him rewrite her history, erase her memories, and take everything she had fought for. She had survived too much, and she wasn't about to be broken by him now. She knew what she had to do. She would go through every scrap of paper, every document, every record she could find, and uncover the truth. If Ethan thought he could pull the wool over her eyes, he was sorely mistaken. Victoria Hale was done being the victim in her own story. It was time for her to take control, to find the proof she needed to show that he had been manipulating her all along. Victoria grabbed her jacket and headed out the door, determination set in her eyes. The search for the truth had begun. She would uncover every lie, every piece of evidence, and when she did, she would finally take back what was hers. Victoria's fingers hovered over the keyboard, a cold shiver running down her spine. She had spent the past few days buried in piles of old documents, correspondence, and financial records. Anything she could find that would help her unravel the truth behind Ethan's betrayal. Each file she opened seemed to open a new door to a disturbing reality she hadn't expected. Ethan, the brother she once trusted above all else, had been hiding secrets from her, secrets that, if exposed, could ruin not just his life, but her own. Her eyes darted over the pages in front of her, scanning the figures and notes, her mind piecing together the puzzle. It wasn't just the sale of the house that had been deceptive. Ethan's entire financial history seemed to be a web of lies. Contracts, shell companies, accounts under fictitious names. It was like he had carefully orchestrated a life that was impossible to trace back to him. She pulled out another folder, the one marked defence contracts, and carefully flipped through the pages. There were emails, communication logs, and financial documents that seemed to connect Ethan's name to several government contracts. But as she looked closer, a sickening feeling began to settle in her stomach. These weren't just ordinary contracts, they were deals that didn't make sense. Invoices that were inflated, requests for equipment that didn't seem to align with the project descriptions, and suppliers that were, at best, unqualified. Victoria sat back in her chair, stunned. This was worse than she had imagined. Ethan hadn't just been manipulating her, he had been manipulating the system. There were irregularities in the military supply chain, and it seemed that Ethan had been at the centre of it all. But it wasn't just about money. These were deals that involved national security, and Victoria couldn't help but feel the weight of what she had uncovered. But she needed more. These documents were compelling, but they weren't enough. She had to dig deeper. As if on cue, her phone buzzed. The name on the screen was unfamiliar, but the number had a familiar area code, one she hadn't seen in years. Her hand hesitated over the phone, but then she answered, her voice steady. "Victoria Hale," she said, keeping her tone even. "Victoria, it's Jim Thornton, from your old unit." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. Jim Thornton? She hadn't heard from him in ages. Jim had been one of her closest comrades, a man who had seen her at her most vulnerable during their deployment. They had survived battles together, had been through hell and back. To hear from him now was both a relief and a cause for concern. "Jim, it's been a while," she replied, her voice tight. "What's going on?" "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I think you've got a bigger problem than you realise," Jim said, his voice low, urgent. "I've been tracking some of the things you've been investigating, and it's not just your brother's shady business dealings. He's mixed up in something far worse." Victoria's stomach churned. "What do you mean? What's he involved in?" Jim hesitated before responding. "Ethan's been funneling government contracts to a group of private military contractors who are laundering money. But it's deeper than that, Vic. He's been siphoning off funds for years, using his connections to get access to sensitive military operations. And from what I've seen, it's treasonous. He's selling information, Victoria, to foreign entities." Her heart pounded in her chest. She felt a rush of dizziness as the weight of Jim's words settled over her. Ethan, her brother, had been selling out the country. It was more than she could comprehend. "How do you know this?" Victoria asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside her. "I've got a contact in military intelligence who's been feeding me some intel. It's hard to verify everything, but the pieces are starting to come together. You need to be careful, Vic. If Ethan finds out you're onto him, he'll do anything to stop you." Victoria was silent for a moment, processing the gravity of what Jim had just revealed. Ethan hadn't just betrayed her, he had betrayed the country. The man she had once looked up to, trusted with everything, had turned out to be a criminal on a scale she never could have imagined. "Thank you for telling me this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't known." "I'm here for you always," Jim replied. "But be careful. If you dig too deep, Ethan's not the only one you'll be up against. There are people involved who are much bigger than him." The line went silent for a moment, and then Jim added, "I'll keep in touch, but make sure you stay safe. This goes deeper than you think." The phone call ended, and Victoria sat in stunned silence, staring at the screen. She had known her brother had done something wrong, but this was on an entirely different level. She couldn't believe it. And yet the evidence was there, right in front of her. Ethan had been involved in something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Victoria clenched her fists, her heart racing. She could feel the weight of the truth pressing on her chest, but she couldn't back down now. This was it, the final straw. She couldn't allow Ethan or anyone else involved to get away with this. It wasn't just her life on the line anymore. It was the lives of countless others. Victoria stood up, her resolve hardening like steel. She was going to expose Ethan for what he truly was. She wasn't going to let him manipulate her anymore. It was time to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. Victoria paced back and forth in her small apartment, her mind reeling from the information she had uncovered. Each document, each piece of evidence she sifted through seemed to dig a deeper grave for her brother Ethan. What had started as a simple concern about the sale of their childhood home had blossomed into something far more sinister. Ethan had been playing a game for years, and she had only just discovered the first few moves. She opened yet another folder, this time one labelled military contracts, and her eyes scanned the papers in front of her. The more she read, the more her heart sank. There were emails, financial transactions, and invoices linking Ethan's name to illegal dealings with private contractors. What made it worse was that these contractors were dealing with military contracts that involved sensitive operations and national security. She couldn't fathom how deep his betrayal went. The contracts didn't just involve money, they involved lives. Military supplies were being siphoned off, equipment that was meant to support soldiers in the field was being diverted to unscrupulous buyers. This wasn't just about wealth, it was about undermining the very system she had sworn to protect. Ethan was not just a criminal, he was a traitor. Victoria slammed the folder shut, frustration and disbelief swirling inside her. How could he do this? How could the man she once admired, the brother she thought she could trust, be capable of such treachery? It felt like the ground beneath her was shifting, like everything she had believed in had been shattered in a matter of days. As if the universe was toying with her, her phone buzzed on the table. Victoria stared at the screen. An unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat, and she hesitated before answering. It was a call she never expected. "Victoria, it's Jim," a familiar voice said. Jim Thornton, one of her old comrades from the military, a man she had fought beside and trusted with her life. "Jim?" Victoria replied, her voice tight. "What's going on?" "I've been hearing things. You need to listen closely," Jim said, his tone low, serious. "I know what you're digging into, and it's worse than you think. Ethan's in way deeper than just some shady contracts. He's been selling information, sensitive classified military intel, the kind of stuff that can bring down entire operations." Victoria felt a chill crawl down her spine. "What do you mean? Selling information to who?" Jim sighed, the sound of rustling paper on his end of the line. "To foreign entities. The same contractors he's been working with, they're connected to a network of people who aren't just interested in making money. They're interested in the kind of power that comes with knowing our secrets. Ethan's been feeding them intel. He's selling out the country, Vic." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the weight of Jim's words hit her. She had suspected Ethan of wrongdoing, but nothing had prepared her for this. Ethan was not only a traitor to their family, he was a traitor to their country. The man she had once looked up to, the man she thought she could trust with her very life, had turned against everything they had fought for. "I don't know what to say," Victoria murmured, her mind racing. "How do you know all of this?" "I've got sources," Jim replied, "but you need to be careful. This is bigger than you think, Vic. There are people involved who will do anything to protect themselves. You're in more danger than you realise." Victoria took a deep breath, trying to steady her shaking hands. The news was overwhelming, but she couldn't afford to break down now. Jim's words were a reminder of the stakes. It wasn't just her family's honour on the line anymore. It was her country's security. "Thanks for telling me this," Victoria said, her voice stronger now, a steely resolve settling over her. "I'll take it from here." "Don't do this alone," Jim warned. "You're not just fighting your brother now, you're fighting an entire network." Victoria hung up the phone, her thoughts racing. She was alone in this fight, but she wouldn't back down. The truth had to come out. She couldn't let Ethan get away with what he had done. not after everything they had been through together. Victoria knew what she had to do next. She had to confront Ethan, bring everything into the light. But to do that, she needed more than just documents. She needed undeniable proof, something concrete that would leave no room for doubt. She had to build a case, to expose him in front of the world. As she sat down at her desk, her fingers hovered over the keyboard once more. She wasn't sure how she would get everything she needed, but she wasn't going to stop until she had the answers. Ethan had underestimated her, but he was about to learn just how far she was willing to go to uncover the truth. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the trial continued. Victoria sat still, her expression unreadable, while Ethan stood on the other side, his confidence radiating as if he had already won. He was no longer the brother she once knew. He was a man with a facade of innocence, trying to manipulate the system, to twist the truth in his favour. But Victoria had something he didn't. Proof. She had spent countless nights gathering the evidence, piecing together a picture that would expose him for what he truly was. Ethan's lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man, stood before the judge, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Your Honour, my client has been the victim of a tragic series of misunderstandings. He only ever sought to protect his family, to ensure his sister's well-being. It's clear that she has fallen victim to the horrors of war, and her actions are a symptom of her mental state." Victoria's heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained composed. She had heard this same narrative before, the one Ethan had sold to everyone who would listen. But this time, there was no room for manipulation. She wasn't the broken sister he painted her to be. This time, she had the upper hand. The judge nodded, acknowledging Ethan's lawyer's argument, but Victoria knew the real battle was just beginning. Ethan's words were meant to sway the jury, to cloud their judgment. He had done it so many times before, making her feel insignificant. But now, with every word he spoke, she could see the cracks in his story. He was losing control, and she was about to expose the truth. Her lawyer gave her a brief nod, signalling that it was time. Victoria stood, her movements deliberate and calm, as she walked to the front of the courtroom. Every step felt like a victory in itself. She wasn't just walking to present evidence. She was walking to take back her life, her identity, and everything that Ethan had stolen from her. The room grew quiet as she placed a stack of documents on the table. The first document was a military contract, one that detailed several transactions linked directly to Ethan's name. Victoria spoke clearly, her voice unwavering as she laid out the facts. "These documents detail a series of fraudulent military contracts that my brother Ethan Hale orchestrated. These contracts were meant for legitimate government operations, but instead they were funneled through shell companies controlled by Ethan, allowing him to siphon funds and sell government secrets to foreign entities." The courtroom fell silent as the weight of her words settled in. Ethan's lawyer opened his mouth to speak, but the judge raised a hand, signalling for him to stop. He motioned for the bailiff to take the documents, his eyes scanning them quickly. The room waited with bated breath. Victoria watched Ethan's face as the truth began to sink in. His confident posture wavered, his usual self-assured expression replaced with something she had never seen before: fear. He had always been the one in control, always the one calling the shots. But now the truth was out, and there was no way for him to hide behind his lies anymore. As the judge continued to review the documents, the tension in the room escalated. Victoria's heart raced, but she didn't flinch. This was the moment she had prepared for, the moment she would finally take control of her story. The years of betrayal, the years of being overlooked and manipulated, had all led to this point, and she wasn't going to back down now. Then the twist that no one expected came. The doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly burst open. 12 soldiers in full military gear filed in, their boots echoing on the floor. The room went silent as the Green Berets, the very unit that Victoria had once served with, moved with the precision and discipline that only a military force could exhibit. They were here for one reason, and one reason only. Major Carlin Raw, her former commanding officer, stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. "Ethan Hale," he said, his voice cold and firm, "you are under arrest by the Department of Defense for violations of the False Claims Act, wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States." The air in the courtroom seemed to freeze as Ethan's face drained of colour. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His lawyer stood there speechless as the gravity of the situation hit home. Victoria could hardly believe it herself. The sound of handcuffs clicking into place echoed through the room as the soldiers moved in to arrest her brother. The bailiff stepped forward, reading Ethan his rights in a monotone voice, the official nature of the process making it all feel surreal. "Ethan, what's happening?" his wife, Sarafina, cried from the front row, her voice trembling. She stood up, but one of the soldiers motioned for her to sit back down. Ethan tried to pull himself together, his voice shaking as he looked at Victoria. "You don't know what you're doing. I'm your brother. You can't let them do this." But Victoria remained silent, her eyes hardening. She had heard those words too many times before. He had always tried to manipulate her, to guilt her into submission. But not this time. Not anymore. The soldiers escorted Ethan out of the courtroom, his face filled with disbelief, his expensive suit looking out of place in the chaotic scene. Sarafina sat down, her face a mask of shock and fear. The courtroom was still as the weight of the moment settled on everyone present. Victoria stood there, feeling the rush of triumph surge through her, but as the soldiers led her brother away, a strange emptiness filled her chest. She had won. She had exposed him for what he truly was, and yet there was no joy in the victory. It felt like an old wound had been opened, but there was no healing to follow. Victoria turned to her lawyer, who gave her a quiet nod. "You did it," he said softly. She nodded, but the words felt hollow. She had won the battle, but the war, her war, was far from over. The courtroom was in utter silence. The arrest of Ethan Hale by the Department of Defense had sent a shockwave through the room. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Victoria stood there, watching the soldiers lead her brother away. She had expected some kind of emotional release, a sense of triumph, relief, or even joy, but instead she felt an unsettling emptiness settle deep inside her. Her heart was pounding, but it wasn't from victory. It was from the weight of what had just happened. She had always seen Ethan as her brother, the one person who was supposed to have her back. Yet here she was, witnessing him being dragged away in handcuffs, facing charges of treason. The betrayal she had felt had been immense, but nothing prepared her for this final moment. It wasn't just a betrayal of her, it was a betrayal of everything they had both stood for. The judge called for order in the courtroom, his voice cutting through the stillness. "We will take a short recess," he announced, his tone neutral but with an undercurrent of disbelief. It was as though the entire courtroom had just witnessed something they couldn't quite comprehend, and they needed a moment to process it. Victoria felt her legs weaken as she sat down. Her mind was reeling. It had all happened so fast. She had walked into that courtroom thinking she would be the one on trial, the one whose honour was being questioned. But in the end, it was Ethan who had been exposed for the criminal he was. But why did it feel like an empty victory? The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside as people began to murmur and shift in their seats. Some were congratulating her, others were talking about the implications of the case. Victoria barely heard any of it. She couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything, she hadn't truly won. Ethan had been caught, but there was no sense of satisfaction, no sense of closure, just a cold, empty feeling. Her lawyer, who had been standing quietly beside her, finally broke the silence. "You did it, Victoria," he said softly, his voice tinged with awe. "You stood up for yourself, and you've exposed him for who he really is. You've won." But Victoria didn't feel like a winner. She looked down at her hands, still trembling from the weight of everything she had uncovered, from the mountain of lies and manipulation that Ethan had built his life on. She had fought for so long, but now that it was over, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the end of something she couldn't quite grasp. Her thoughts were interrupted when a woman from the prosecution approached. "Victoria," she said, her voice kind but firm, "I just want to commend you. You've shown great strength today. This isn't just about family, it's about the country. You did the right thing." Victoria nodded, but the words didn't reach her. They felt empty. She had done what needed to be done, but at what cost? The damage was done. Ethan had sold out their country, and now he would pay the price. But what about her? What was left for her after this? The people who had been her family had all turned out to be the very people she had to fight against. She had won the battle, but she wasn't sure what she had left to fight for. The judge returned to the bench, signalling the end of the recess. The room fell silent again as everyone took their seats. Victoria remained seated, staring at the empty chair where her brother had sat moments ago. The finality of his arrest settled into her bones. Then the judge spoke, his voice stern. "Ethan Hale will be held in custody pending further proceedings. His involvement in this case, along with the evidence presented, leaves no room for doubt that he has acted in violation of national security." The courtroom murmured in agreement, and the weight of the judge's words hung in the air. Ethan was facing serious charges that would ruin his life. But Victoria felt no satisfaction in that. In the pit of her stomach, there was only a gnawing emptiness. As the proceedings continued, Victoria's mind began to wander. The case was almost over, but there was a deeper question that lingered in her mind. What now? What was the point of winning when it came at the expense of everything she had once held dear? Ethan was being exposed, but the person who had taken the most from her was herself. She'd spent so many years trying to please her family, trying to be someone she wasn't, all while being manipulated by Ethan. Now she had destroyed him. But in doing so, she had lost her family, her past, and all the hopes she had once held for a better future. Victoria stood up, her legs still shaky. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to let the emptiness defeat her. She would find a way to rebuild, to heal, to move forward from all of this. But it wouldn't be easy. It couldn't be. She had just dismantled her entire life, and now she had to rebuild from the ground up. As she walked out of the courtroom, her heart heavy with the weight of her victory, Victoria made a silent promise to herself. She would no longer be a victim in her own story. She would move forward, not just for herself, but for the men and women who had fought alongside her. She had the strength to rebuild. It was time to stop being the woman who had to fight for recognition and become the woman who fought for her own future. Victoria stood at the window of her new office, overlooking the bustling streets of the city. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of control over her life. The weight of the past was still there, lurking in the back of her mind. But for the first time, it no longer defined her. She had fought for so long, not just against her brother, but against a system that had always seen her as lesser. Now she was building something of her own, something that was hers and hers alone. She had opened the Veterans Support Centre 2 months ago, a place where men and women who had served could find the support and camaraderie they needed to heal. It had been hard at first, trying to find the right place in the world, trying to push through the memories of her own time in the military, but slowly it had become a sanctuary, a place for those who had been broken by war, just as she had been. But as much as she had tried to move forward, as much as she wanted to embrace this new chapter of her life, the scars of the past were still there. She wasn't sure if they would ever fade completely. She had built this centre with the hope that it would heal her as much as it helped the others. But the truth was, she still had so much to confront. Victoria sighed and sat down at her desk, sorting through a pile of papers. Just as she was about to push them aside, a letter caught her attention. It was from Sarafina. Her fingers tightened around the paper as she read the elegant handwriting on the envelope. Sarafina had always written letters in this old-fashioned way, as if trying to preserve the dignity she thought they had. With a deep breath, Victoria tore open the letter and began reading. "Dearest Victoria," it began, "I don't know how to begin, but I must say this. I am so sorry for everything that has happened, for the pain I've caused you. I never truly understood the depths of Ethan's betrayal until it was too late. I regret everything, Victoria. Please let us start over. Let me make it right." Victoria felt her heart tighten as she read the words. A part of her wanted to feel the relief of finally receiving an apology, the validation that she had been right all along. But another part of her, one that had been burned too many times by the false promises of her family, knew better than to believe it. She had heard the same kind of apology before, from Ethan, from her parents, from everyone who had never really seen her. They were all the same, empty words, meant to ease their own guilt, meant to pull her back into their world of manipulation. Sarafina's letter was no different. It was an attempt to absolve herself, to regain the control that had been lost. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she reread the letter. She had been vulnerable once, hoping for love and understanding from these people, but not anymore. Her family, Ethan, Sarafina, her parents, they had all failed her in the most profound ways. And no apology would change that. She set the letter down, her fingers lingering on the edges of the paper. Her thoughts were conflicted. She had every right to be angry, to push them all out of her life. But she also knew that holding on to that anger forever wouldn't make her stronger. It would only keep her tethered to a past that no longer served her. She stood up from her desk, pacing the small office. The words of Sarafina still echoed in her mind, but they no longer held power over her. She had spent so many years trying to make them see her, trying to make them care, but it was never going to happen. Her family wasn't her strength, they were her burden. It was at that moment that she realized something important. Family wasn't just about blood. It wasn't about being bound to people who had never cared for her. Family was something she could choose, something she had already found in the soldiers who had fought beside her, in the veterans who now walked through the door of her centre seeking help. As she looked out the window, a wave of calm washed over her. She had built something real, something that would outlast her past and give her the family she had always craved, not through blood, but through shared experiences and mutual respect. She walked over to the small bookshelf in the corner of her office, pulling down a framed photo of her old unit. They were her family now, the ones who had seen her at her lowest, the ones who had stood by her, no questions asked. They had never betrayed her. They had never manipulated her. They had simply been there, in the trenches, fighting beside her. A small smile tugged at the corner of Victoria's lips as she picked up the letter from Sarafina once more. She folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer, locking it away. The past was the past, and it was time to move on. There would be no forgiveness, no second chances. Not for them. She opened the door to the centre and walked out into the main room. A few veterans were sitting in the chairs, talking quietly among themselves. Victoria felt a sense of pride in her chest. This was what mattered now. This was her family. The journey wasn't over. She still had a lot of healing to do, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was heading in the right direction. The days since the arrest had passed in a blur. Victoria had kept herself busy, far too busy to think. She threw herself into her new role at the Veterans Support Centre, making sure that no one else had to go through the isolation and neglect she had experienced. This centre, this sanctuary for soldiers, had become her life. Every day, it seemed like the work was endless, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had purpose. Helping others had always been part of who she was. She had always been the one to hold people up, the one to help her comrades when they were struggling. And now she was helping those who needed it most, veterans who had been forgotten, ignored by the system, just like she had once been. But this time, she wasn't doing it for approval. She wasn't looking for recognition. She was doing it because it was the right thing to do. But still, every now and then, Victoria found herself alone with her thoughts. And when that happened, the past crept in, just like it always did. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she would ever truly heal from the wounds left by her family. The betrayal of her brother, the manipulation by Ethan, had left scars that no amount of helping others could erase. Her phone buzzed one morning as she was going through the day's intake forms. She looked at the screen and saw an unfamiliar name, Sarafina. Victoria's fingers froze as she stared at the message. It had been months since the trial, since Ethan's arrest. And now Sarafina was reaching out. She hadn't expected this, not from her. The woman who had once stood by her husband's side, pretending to care, pretending to be a part of the family. Now she was asking for forgiveness. The text simply read, "Victoria, I know this may be hard to hear, but I need to apologise. Everything has fallen apart, and I see now how blind I was. Ethan has made terrible mistakes, but I also realise how much I hurt you by enabling him. I wish we could start over, if you're willing. Please let me try to make things right." Victoria stared at the screen, her heart racing. She could feel the anger rising within her, but at the same time there was an odd sense of exhaustion. The last thing she needed was another apology from someone who had been part of her pain. Sarafina had been a willing accomplice in the lies, in the manipulation. How could she expect forgiveness now? A twisted part of Victoria almost wanted to respond, to lash out, to tell Sarafina how cruelly she had been treated by both her and Ethan. But another part of her, one that had learned over the years that holding on to that anger was poison, simply couldn't bring herself to go down that path. She had already cut ties with her family, and that had been the right decision. But Sarafina's apology still lingered in her mind, and for a moment Victoria felt the weight of it settle into her chest. No, she couldn't go back to that life. She couldn't go back to the lies, the manipulation. She couldn't let them pull her back into their web of guilt and false promises. The last time she had tried to make them see her, to make them acknowledge her, she had ended up feeling smaller than ever. Victoria sighed, her fingers hovering over the phone. With a steady hand she typed, "I don't need your apology, and I don't need you in my life anymore." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. It felt like a weight had been lifted off her chest, but at the same time it left an emptiness that she couldn't fill. It wasn't the closure she had wanted, it wasn't the peace she had hoped for, but it was what she needed to do. The anger, the resentment, it was all still there, simmering beneath the surface. But Victoria wasn't the same person she had been when she first walked into that courtroom. She had fought for her own truth, and now she was free, free from the need for their approval, free from the need to be a part of a family that had never really wanted her. She stood up from her desk and walked to the door of the centre, looking out at the faces of the men and women who were beginning to trust her. This was her real family now. The ones who had fought alongside her, the ones who had been through the worst and had come out stronger for it. They were the ones who saw her for who she truly was, not a victim, not someone who needed saving, but someone who had already saved herself. As she watched the veterans talking and laughing in the next room, Victoria smiled. She had built something real, something that would help others heal in the same way she was starting to heal. The past was never going to be fully behind her. The pain would always be a part of her, but it no longer had control over her. Victoria understood now that family wasn't defined by blood. It wasn't about the people who were supposed to love you, but the ones who actually did, the ones who showed up when you needed them the most. She had created a family of choice, a family built on mutual respect, trust, and understanding, and that was enough. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Victoria was no longer afraid. She had faced the worst of her past, and she was finally ready to look forward to the future. Victoria stood in the middle of the bustling veteran support centre, watching the men and women who had come in today, seeking guidance. The familiar hum of conversations and quiet laughter filled the air, and for the first time in a long time, Victoria felt like she had truly found her place in the world. This was her family now, her brothers and sisters in arms. They had been through the fire together, and they understood her in ways no one else ever could. It wasn't just about helping others, it was about building something that had always been missing in her life, a sense of belonging. She had been so focused on the absence of love from her family that she hadn't noticed the deep well of connection she had with the people she had fought beside. They had shared the same pain, the same struggles, and now they were healing together. Every day she spent at the centre, Victoria felt a little stronger. The emotional wounds left by her family's betrayal were still there, still raw, but they were no longer the defining force in her life. Helping others heal had begun to heal her own heart. She no longer needed validation from the people who had hurt her. She had found a new source of strength. As she walked through the centre, greeting the veterans and checking in with them, she felt a deep sense of pride. She was no longer the broken woman who had walked into the courtroom months ago. She had become a leader, someone others could rely on. She had learned that true healing came from within, and while the scars would always remain, they didn't have to dictate who she was. But just as she was beginning to embrace this new chapter, something unexpected happened. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. When she checked the screen, her heart skipped a beat. It was a message from someone she hadn't heard from in months, Sarafina. Victoria's hand trembled slightly as she read the text. Victoria, I know this might be hard to hear, but I need to speak with you. I've realized how wrong I was, and I want to make things right between us. Please let me explain. Victoria stared at the words, feeling the familiar surge of anger and confusion. Sarafina, Ethan's wife, had been just as complicit in everything that had happened. She had been the one who had stood by Ethan, supporting him in his manipulation and deceit. The thought of speaking with her again, of giving her another chance to explain herself, made Victoria's skin crawl. Her first instinct was to ignore the message, to block Sarafina's number and never think about her again. After everything that had happened, why would she ever want to go back to that? But as she stood there, phone in hand, a quiet voice inside her told her to pause, to think about it for a moment. She remembered the woman Sarafina had once been, someone who had appeared to care, someone who had offered false warmth and affection, but now Victoria saw the truth. Sarafina's apology wasn't about reconciliation, it was about her own guilt. She wasn't trying to make amends for Victoria's sake, she was doing it for her own peace of mind. Victoria felt a pang of sadness, not for herself, but for the life she had once hoped for, one where her family would come together, where forgiveness could heal the wounds they had caused. But that wasn't her reality anymore. Sarafina had been part of the system that had hurt her, and now she wanted to erase the damage with a few well-chosen words. For a moment, a deep ache settled in Victoria's chest. She had spent so many years wanting her family's love, wanting to be accepted by them, but now she understood something important. Family wasn't about blood. It was about the people who showed up for you, who fought alongside you, who cared for you when you needed it most. And those people were not her family of origin. Her family was the one she had built here at the centre. With a deep breath, Victoria composed her response. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen, typing out the words with a clarity she hadn't felt in months. I don't need your apology, and I don't need you in my life. I've already found my family, and it's not you. Please don't contact me again. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The moment the message was sent, a heavy weight lifted off her shoulders. It was done. There would be no more lingering in the past. No more false hopes. Sarafina wasn't a part of her story anymore, and Victoria was finally free of that chapter. But as she stared at her phone, she couldn't deny the small ache in her chest. She had lost something she had once longed for, a sense of belonging within her family. But what she had gained was far more valuable. She had found a new family, one built on mutual respect, understanding, and shared experience. As she placed the phone down, a veteran walked into the room, smiling as he waved at her. Victoria smiled back, her heart swelling with a sense of purpose. This was her family, the people who fought beside her, the people who cared for her without judgment. This was where she belonged. And with that, she knew that the healing wasn't over. It would take time. But she was no longer fighting alone. She had a community that understood her, a community that would stand by her as she moved forward into the future. And that future, for the first time in a long time, looked bright. As the weeks passed, Victoria found herself settling into a rhythm at the Veterans Support Centre. The work was hard, often exhausting, but it brought her a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in years. She poured herself into helping others, listening to their stories and offering them the kind of support she had once desperately needed herself. Every day, veterans came in, some with visible scars, others with those that couldn't be seen, but all of them had one thing in common: they had been broken by the weight of war, just as she had been. And in helping them, Victoria realised something crucial. Healing wasn't just about fixing the damage done. It was about finding a community, about creating a new sense of belonging. For so long she had craved the love and approval of her family, but now she realised that the family she had been searching for wasn't the one she had been born into. It was the one she was building here, the bonds she was forming with the people around her, her fellow veterans, the ones who had walked through the fire with her, were stronger than anything she had ever experienced with her blood relatives. Yet, despite the progress she was making, there were moments when the weight of the past would still press down on her. Late at night, when she lay in bed, Victoria would sometimes find herself staring at the ceiling, feeling the void left by her family's absence. It wasn't that she wanted to go back to them, but there was an ache that lingered, a sadness that she had lost something she had once hoped to have. One evening, as she sat in her office reviewing some paperwork, her phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but there was something in her gut that told her it was important. With a sigh, she picked up the phone. "Victoria?" The voice on the other end was instantly recognisable. It was Jim, one of her old comrades from the military, a man who had been a constant source of support during the darkest times of her career. "Jim, it's been a while," Victoria replied, trying to keep her tone neutral. I know, Jim said, his voice laced with concern. "Listen, I've been hearing things, and I thought you should know. Sarafina, she's trying to reach you again. She's been calling around, trying to apologise, trying to make things right." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. Sarafina, Ethan's wife, the woman who had stood by him while he manipulated and betrayed her, was reaching out again? Victoria could already feel the anger stirring inside her. She had worked so hard to move on from everything her family had put her through. Now it seemed like they were trying to pull her back in. "I don't need her apology," Victoria said, her voice steady but firm. "I've moved on, Jim. I've built something for myself, something that matters. I don't need her or anyone else from that past." Jim's voice softened. "I know you've worked hard to get where you are, Victoria, and I respect that. But I just wanted you to know what's going on. I don't want you to be blindsided." Victoria's thoughts swirled as she hung up the phone. Sarafina's attempt at reaching out felt like a manipulation, a way to ease her own guilt. Victoria had already been down that road once, and she wasn't going to let it happen again. She had done the hard work of walking away from her family, from the people who had never truly cared for her. She wasn't going to let them back into her life now, no matter how many apologies they offered. The truth was, Sarafina's apology was more about absolving herself than it was about repairing their relationship. Victoria wasn't the same person who had longed for their approval. She wasn't looking for forgiveness anymore. She had found something far more valuable, her own strength, her own sense of self. That night, as Victoria lay in bed, she felt the familiar ache of loss, but it didn't feel as heavy as it once had. She had lost her family, but in the process, she had gained so much more. The centre, the veterans she worked with, the friends she had made, they were the family she had built from the ground up. They were the ones who understood her, who saw her for who she truly was, not for the person her family had tried to make her. The next day she did what she knew was right. She blocked Sarafina's number. There would be no more messages, no more false promises of reconciliation. Victoria had fought too hard to get to where she was, and she wasn't going to let anyone, even Sarafina, drag her back into a past that no longer served her. The decision wasn't easy, but it was necessary. She had already said goodbye to her old life, and she wasn't going to go back, not even for a second. It was time to focus on the future. Victoria walked into the centre the next day with a new sense of purpose. She had made the choice to move forward, to keep building the life she had always wanted, but never thought possible. It wasn't easy, and there would be moments of doubt, but Victoria was no longer afraid of what the future held. She had created a family of her own, a family built on trust, understanding, and shared experience. And that, she realised, was all she needed. Victoria stood at the entrance of the Veterans Support Centre, watching as the doors opened and closed, letting in the steady flow of people who had come seeking help. The centre had grown significantly over the past year, and as she watched the faces of the men and women who walked through, a deep sense of pride filled her chest. They weren't just visitors, they were survivors, just like her, and together they were building something that mattered. This was her new life, one she had built from the ground up. She no longer felt tethered to her past, to the family that had abandoned her. She had created her own family here, a family forged through shared experiences, mutual respect and understanding. The pain of her past had not disappeared, but it no longer controlled her. Instead, she had taken the pieces of that pain and transformed them into something meaningful. The work was hard, often emotionally taxing, but it was also incredibly fulfilling. Helping other veterans find their way after the war had been a healing process for her as much as it was for them. It had given her a sense of purpose, a reason to wake up each morning and keep going. And it had allowed her to find the peace she had so desperately been seeking for so long. As the days passed, Victoria felt the weight of her past growing lighter. The centre was thriving, and she had begun to plan for its future. More programs, more outreach, more ways to reach those who needed it most. It was a dream that she had long given up on, but now it was a reality. She was finally able to give back in a way that felt true to who she had become, not who she had once been. But then, one day, as she sat in her office, poring over new intake forms, the phone on her desk rang. She glanced at the caller ID and saw a number she didn't recognise. A wave of unease washed over her as she picked up the receiver. "Victoria Hale?" a voice asked, low and serious. "Yes, this is she," Victoria replied, a sense of foreboding creeping into her chest. "Victoria, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I think you should know what's been going on," the voice continued. "I'm a former colleague of your brother's, and I've been tracking some things. I know what he's been up to, and it's not just about money. It's worse than you can imagine." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" There was a long pause before the voice on the other end spoke again, a grimness to its tone. "Ethan didn't just sell military contracts. He's been selling information, sensitive, classified information. He sold out the very people he once swore to protect. One of your old comrades, a man named Leo Santiago, was killed in a firefight because the supplies they needed didn't make it on time. The supplies were diverted by Ethan." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Ethan, her brother, had caused the death of one of her closest friends. The betrayal was deeper than she had ever imagined. She had known that Ethan was capable of terrible things, but this was unforgivable. "Are you sure?" Victoria asked, her voice shaky with disbelief. "I've seen the paperwork, Victoria. It's all there. Ethan didn't just steal money. He was responsible for the deaths of men and women who trusted him, and he did it for a price. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, choking her ability to speak. She could feel the room closing in around her, and for a moment she wondered if she had heard him wrong, but she knew she hadn't. She had always suspected that Ethan's actions went deeper than she knew, but she never thought it would reach this far. Her brother hadn't just betrayed her, he had betrayed everything they had fought for, everything that had meant something to her. "Who are you?" she asked, trying to regain some semblance of control. The voice sighed. "I'm just someone who's seen enough. I can't stand by and let him get away with this. The man who caused all this suffering has to pay for his actions." Victoria sat back in her chair, her hands trembling as she processed the news. Leo was dead because of Ethan's greed. And there were more like him, more who had been abandoned, forgotten, and ultimately sacrificed for nothing more than profit. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her racing heart. The anger she had felt toward Ethan in the past now seemed trivial in comparison to the depth of his betrayal. He had taken lives, he had destroyed families. But as the initial shock began to fade, a sense of clarity settled in. She had already walked away from him. She had already severed the ties that bound her to him and to the family that had never supported her. Now she understood that her fight wasn't just for herself. It was for everyone who had been affected by Ethan's treachery. Victoria knew what she had to do next. She had to expose the truth. She had to make sure Ethan couldn't hide behind his lies anymore. She wasn't going to let him destroy more lives. The fight wasn't over yet. As she hung up the phone, she felt a sense of resolve flood through her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she had faced worse. She wasn't backing down now. Ethan had taken enough from her and from others. It was time to take back control. The days passed like waves on the shore, each one bringing something new, a sense of progress, a feeling of accomplishment. Victoria had become more than just a survivor. She had become a builder. The Veterans Support Centre, once a small idea in the back of her mind, was now thriving. It had become her lifeline, a place where she could channel all the pain and frustration of her past into something meaningful. Every day, veterans walked through the door, some broken and lost, others trying to rebuild their lives. And Victoria was there, offering guidance, providing support, and most of all, offering understanding. She had seen the same struggles, felt the same hurt. She knew what it was like to feel invisible, to feel like the world was closing in, to be haunted by the ghosts of the past. And now, she was giving them the strength to overcome. The centre had grown to include more programs, outreach initiatives, and support groups. It was no longer just a place for people to talk. It had become a sanctuary, a home for those who had nowhere else to go. And as she watched the people who had once been just strangers now becoming a community, a family, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. But just as she began to settle into this new life, something unexpected happened. Victoria's phone rang late one afternoon, the number unfamiliar, but something in her gut told her it was important. She picked up the phone, her heart stilling as the voice on the other end spoke. "Victoria, this is Peter Moreno. I was in your unit back in Afghanistan." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't heard from Peter in years. He had been one of the soldiers who had fought alongside her, one of the few who truly understood what she had been through. She had lost touch with him after her discharge, but his voice brought back memories of a time when things had felt simpler, when they had all been in the fight together. "Peter, it's good to hear from you," Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion. "How have you been?" There was a long pause before Peter's voice came through again, softer now. "I've been all right, Vic, but there's something I need to tell you, something that might change everything." Victoria felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "What is it?" "Ethan," Peter began, his voice trembling. "I know you've probably already heard about the things he's done, the military contracts, but what you don't know is that one of the soldiers in your unit, Leo Santiago, was killed because of it. The supplies that were supposed to be sent to your team, they never made it. Ethan was behind it. He made sure those supplies were diverted, and as a result, Leo died. The words hit Victoria like a slap in the face. She had suspected Ethan's actions, but hearing the full extent of it, knowing that her brother's betrayal had cost the life of someone she had known, someone she had fought beside, was more than she could bear. The pain, the guilt, the realization that her brother had been the cause of it, it was unbearable. "Peter, I don't know what to say," she whispered, her throat tight with emotion. Leo was like a brother to me. I never knew. I never thought it would go this far." "I didn't know either, Vic. I had no idea what Ethan was up to. But when I started digging into things, it all started to make sense. He didn't just steal money. He put lives at risk. And now there's nothing we can do about it. Leo's gone, and so many others have been hurt because of him." Victoria felt the weight of the truth settle in her chest. The anger she had been holding on to for so long, the resentment and the hurt, now had a target. She had always known Ethan had done bad things, but hearing that he had caused the death of a man she had once called family, the weight of that knowledge was suffocating. But as the anger and pain threatened to consume her, another feeling began to emerge. A feeling of clarity. She had worked so hard to let go of the past, to build something new, something stronger. She'd built a family here at the centre, and that was what mattered now. Leo's death, Ethan's betrayal, it all hurt, but it didn't define her. She was not going to let it break her. Victoria took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Thank you for telling me this, Peter. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive Ethan, but I won't let his actions destroy me. I've already lost too much." Peter's voice softened and he sighed. "You've already shown more strength than I could ever imagine, Vic. You've come so far. Don't let him take that from you." Victoria nodded, even though Peter couldn't see her. "I won't. I found something better than what I had with my family. I found peace, and I'm not going to let anyone take that from me." She hung up the phone, her heart still heavy, but also lighter than it had been before. The betrayal would always hurt. The loss of Leo would never fade. But she had made it through, and she had done it without Ethan, without the family who had abandoned her. And now, as she stood in the centre, surrounded by people who had become her true family, Victoria realised something important. She had truly found freedom. The chains that had bound her to the past had been broken. The future was hers to shape, and she would continue to move forward, building the life she had always wanted, one filled with love, respect, and the strength to overcome whatever came her way.